Hey there, Golden Bears. Welcome to Module 1.3, and I hope you're keeping it classy as I know being brave bears can do. With that, before we dive into the Columbian Exchange, I like to tell a little story that will hopefully help make sense and illustrate some things. When I was in high school, during my senior year, I was able to get a job. I stopped playing baseball, and so that opened up from football season, so late November, all the way up till I went off to college. I worked at this drive-through that was, think of it as like an AM/PM. It had a gas station. It had all the things you can come in and buy, bread and milk and ice creams and everything else, adult beverages. And what made it unique is that it was a drive-through. It was called Sun Up Drive-Through. And it was right on the main strip, right in the middle of town. And people liked it because they never had to get out of the car. So if it was hot out, they can keep the air conditioning on. And I had to trudge along and go to the car door, say, "What can I get for you, sir or ma'am?" They would tell me a list of like 10 things. I'd like to have to remember it. Go to those items, pull them out of their freezer, refrigerator, put them in bags, come up with the total, take the bag to them. They would then hand me the cash. This is like before credit cards, obviously, were that familiar. I would then go back to my register, make the change, and then give it back to them. And this happened, transactions day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, and it was a cool job. What made it cool is that, our kids also, I'm not all kids, my friends, summer long would stop in there every night and say, "Hey, Doug, what's going on for this town? Anything happening?" And so people would stop in, tell us, "Hey, here's something, the flyer to a certain party, is flyer to this event," or they tell us what's taking place. So we became like the intersection, the cross point, this exchange, if you will, of information between what was happening around town. And we got off at 10 o'clock, and depending on how, exciting it was in town, man, we were quick to either get out or really slow, depending on how much money we want to make closing shop, because sometimes it could take an hour, sometimes it could take like 2 minutes, and so this idea of Sun Up Drive-Through, I have fond memories for it, but I could certainly tell you it was the place to be a high school student, and it was just a lot of fun for various reasons. And so why do I tell this to you is that just as it was an exchange of ideas, an exchange of information, exchange of commodities, exchange of money there for us at Sun Up Drive-Through, we're going to be talking about a new exchange taking place on the Mesoamerican soil. We call it Mexico to this day, but it's going to be much bigger than Mexico and that whole region. And it starts with those coming over from Spain and Portugal. So on that note, I'd like to read a quote to you. It says, "The Spanish have the perfect right to rule these barbarians of the New World." Note, point of view put in there. Calling someone a barbarian might not be a good way to earn their trust. "Of the New World and the adjacent islands, who in prudence, skill, virtues, and humanity are as inferior to the Spanish as children to adults or women to men, for there exists," sorry, this is not me, this is Sepulveda saying this, "for there exists between the two as great a difference as between apes and men." Now in class, we're going to be looking at Sepulveda and then comparing, contrasting him to this other priest called Juan de las Casas, and kind of examine how both of these points of view take place. But what I really wanted to touch base upon before we jump into like our objectives is this. Here's a picture of kind of just after or recently after Columbus makes his second return. His second return after he went back to King Ferdinand and Isabella and says, "Hey, this is what I've discovered. Here's some cool commodities to show you, everything from corn and some animals, obviously gold, etc." They fully funded his return and I think gave him, 17 ships. And in those 17 ships, 1,200 soldiers. And think of it as like Noah's Ark. There were almost every man and creature, every creature known to man on that planet. And one such creature were these huge Spanish mastiffs. If you were to see a mastiff now, they're immense dogs, but they're incredibly cool and beautiful and comfortable. We had a neighbor of ours down in Bajo had one, and it was the sweetest little thing that you could have had an infant near and it wouldn't even bother that. But this is what the Spaniards would use to terrorize and you can see the pictures there of I think this is Hispaniola Island where they landed. And it is here that we begin seeing that was once tranquil, was once peaceful, this Mesoamerica that didn't have these foreign beasts, didn't have these foreign people, and more importantly, didn't have these foreign diseases coming into them, kind of taking this beautiful oceanic setting, if you will, that has now been polluted by Columbus and his posse marching up the sand and unwittingly knowing, actually, that they were carrying things there that caused problems, but they certainly brought these dogs and weapons for other purposes in mind. So with that, let us dive in to what this chapter 1.3 is about. So we're going to talk about how there's this exchange of trade and technology, and in particularly foodstuffs, which are very important for you to keep in mind. It's called the Columbian Exchange, and we'll learn about Alfred W. Crosby, a professor at 2 or 3 different universities, but namely University of Texas at Austin, and he was also a Harvard professor. He wrote a book in the mid-50s, early 50s, that basically stated the Mesoamerican world shifted in balance just as much as the European world shifted in balance, with this almost symbiotic relationship or exchange between both sides of the world at that time. Okay. The second point is you're going to see tons of conflict taking place, both in Europe, all trying to vie for this new Mesoamerican soil, and you have conflict between Native Americans and the Europeans, and you're also going to have conflict with forced slaves to come in to work there. And that leads us to the third point. We're going to learn briefly about the labor systems that were brought in by the Portuguese and the Spaniards and eventually the British to this new land. For those of you who are paying attention, we usually do kind of a graphic organizer. Here is the one that you'll be doing or completing for class. This would be helpful for you to print out and use as you're either listening to my lecture, but also as you go through the textbook to kind of cite evidence. Remember, these are going to be great as part of review for those of you who are taking the exam. So let us just jump in. Number 1, the Columbian Exchange transforms 4 continents. Literally all 4 corners of the world are transformed simply because of Christopher Columbus walking upon the shores of Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti, okay, Dominican Republic, and therefore changing the landscape of the world. I remember a college professor calling this where we exchanged, where we had microbes and muskets that were brought by the Europeans that drastically and dramatically changed the landscape. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Alfred W. Crosby was the guru professor that came up with this idea that we'll unpack a little bit further, that brought about this exchange of diseases, plants, animals, ideas, and resources across the globe. It's called the Atlantic world, and it's viewed as a triangle kind of tilted on its side. And the Europeans didn't know this would take place, and those in the Mesoamerica didn't know that this would take place. But we need to be mindful that there's going to be a transfer of products. Namely, in Europe, you have people who want something from the New World. What is that? Resources. Okay? They're then going to go to pick up, do more trade with those along the western seaboard of Africa, to not only have goods, and so they're bringing money and people. They're also going to have good slaves that they're going to forcibly take from the western shores of Africa, and then they're going to take them to the Mesoamericas to both live and to extract and to kind of develop a new set of colonization, we like to call it. What did they get in return? Well, those gold and ivory and these other products that we're going to talk about. I mean, not products, but foodstuffs that will be very, very important to the landscape of Europe as well as to Africa. We're going to, there's a tremendous amount of dying that takes place as a result of this. Can you imagine, this idea of the COVID in 2020 creating havoc across the landscape of America, where approximately 500,000 people died? we're talking to the tune of possibly 3 million up to 9 million. There's a lot of different historical aspects as to what this was about. And the Spaniards didn't know unwittingly that they were bringing this in. That wasn't their intention, to kill these people off. Why? Why would they kill off the people that they planned to kind of enslave and work on their encomienda systems, which I'll talk about here in a little bit? Part of their plan was it's all economic. And if they don't have people to go and extract the gold that they were looking for, well, they're going to have to get those workers from somewhere else, hence slavery coming from Africa at some point. And so this death, often preceding, I mean, by the time Hernan Cortez or by the time Columbus and his 1,500 men would march into different regions, they would discover that most of the people had died by the time they got there. So this made it rather convenient for the Spaniards, but it also created a new solution that was looked toward Africa at the time. So here is a picture, according to Alfred Crosby in 1954, of first contact. And what we need to be mindful of is that the Native Americans of Hispaniola and modern day Haiti, etc., they greeted these Europeans with open arms and open hands and saw them as new potential collaborators, perhaps with trade or perhaps with even greater things. And so what did we give them in return? Well, things that we'll continue to find out about. So please know and be mindful of this Atlantic world trade. I found this map to give you an idea. This is going to become very important in the development of the colonies later on in time period 2 and into 3 specifically, okay? And it is this that we recognize that the Europeans had divergent reasons as to why they wanted to colonize, and you're going to need to keep track of the reasons as to why they want to colonize, but just be mindful. The Spaniards are there they're there for economic reasons with some religious reasons. The French are there just to trade. The Dutch are just there to trade. And we're going to discover the British are going to go with 2 different purposes. Initially, it's to escape religious persecution and establish new colonies based on that. But soon, the King of England, King George at the time, is going to begin recognizing, oh, snap, these other kings in Europe are growing in power. If I want to grow in power, I need to get over to the and establish colonies there as fast as possible in quick time. Going on to the second point. Well, what was this Columbian exchange? Well, it's a biological exchange between the Americas and the rest of the world, and it lasts for a good percentage of about 100 years. And what you need to be mindful of is that, yeah, they just didn't have these huge shipping containers to load them up filled with those containers from Long Beach Harbor. They had to send them over on boats that were slow getting there. Some of them crashed or sunk, etc. But many goods that were sent to Europe, you need to be mindful, were incredibly important. The first one of them is maize or corn. Corn lands in Africa, and it's because of corn and manioc. Manioc is a type of purple potato that, and this is sad, this is a sad truth or reality, is that all those slaves are being taken away by the hundreds and thousands, and it gets into the millions, because of this new American product that can grow so well in sub-Saharan Africa between maize and tomatoes, potatoes, manioc. This gives the African American populations a major boost. So although many are being taken and sent to the Americas, you also have a population that is growing. So it was a very interesting development caused by the Columbian exchange. You might have heard of how potatoes made their way into Northern Europe and into Russia. Without those potatoes, for sure, there would have been famine long before, we probably would have had another time period before 1900s because the society couldn't handle the population growth and not be able to feed everybody at that same time. So it was the Mesoamerica and these new food products that really transformed. Don't forget also sugar. Sugar was really limited to the Philippines area, parts of Southeast Asia, South of Vietnam, etc. They discovered that those islands of the Bahamas and the northern tip of what is that? Northern tip of Central America, not Central America, but Brazil and into forgetting the name, just think northern Brazil and along the coast of Brazil, you can have sugar growing incredibly well in sugarcane. So this is then going to demand the need for slaves. So we'll talk more about this, but I'm just trying to help set the tone of the importance of what the Columbian Exchange did. Now, what did America, kind of send back from them? Well, you have all sorts of rice, which is huge because rice becomes an important staple for many of those living in the slave colonies of Virginia to the North Carolinas to anything called the Chesapeake Bay. Wheat is going to be grown out on the west slopes of Minnesota soon. You're going to have cattle that are going to transform what takes place up in New England. Horses are going to transform and huge typically nomadic people groups there in Mesoamerica through Mexico on up, but they're going to drastically change many of the Native American groups in America as we know them. All right, the Cherokee, the Apache, and this enables them to actually become much stronger and stronger and actually vanquish other tribes like the Paiute who did not have the horses and couldn't keep up. Okay, so here's a visual of that, and I think it'd be very, very important for you in your notes to make a T-chart and keep track of what came over, at least have one or two ideas as to, how is this good and how is this bad. So ultimately, I love this chart that, you see here at the bottom, these items that were brought over from Europe and Africa. But there was one thing here that syphilis happened when the 1,500 soldiers and then soon subsequent other soldiers had taken, I'm sure without permission, the women. Those women gave them syphilis back to Europe. That was at least some due justice for what had happened to them. We'll talk about that in class. So let's talk about the continuation of how different nations changed as a result of this Columbian Exchange. Well, Spain gained in tremendous wealth by recognizing, well, if we encourage poor Europeans to have a new opportunity, or forcing the Native Americans to begin working on the encomienda systems. That encomienda is, think of it as like a large ranch where it is a self-sufficient ranch where they then were forced to work in the fields, kind of like a serf was in the feudalistic times, and Africans taken without their permission, obviously slaves, to look for gold and silver and to cultivate these crops called sugar, which soon sugars have become more valuable, ironically, than gold and silver. But that's not in this time period. It'll be taking place a little later on. The European nations continue to grow this idea of mercantilism, what lifts them out of feudalism and into the early stages of capitalism, which we call mercantilism. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a little kind of idea of how does mercantilism work. Here you have the Queen Mother here that is colonizing various regions of, it could be Africa, it could be Southeast Asia. The country is immaterial, but you can see what the mother country is extracting from them, but primarily raw materials, then to bring back to the mother country to where they can make pottery or furniture or other items, and then guess what? Sell them back to the colonies at a huge profit, or sell them to other parts of Europe. This system is what helped Europe really grow out of a basic feudalistic society and grew into a capitalistic mercantilistic society. Those who had AP European history, this was talked about, I'm sure, tremendously by your teacher. Number two, what happened in Africa? I'm going to kind of blast through this, that we need to recognize, as I talked about in my prior lecture, that it was Portugal that first came along the western coast, and they saw how the Arab merchants were trading with the chiefs, African chiefs, and they had this symbiotic thing where the chiefs were like, sure, I'm going to go capture my enemies and bring them to the Arabs so I can make some money. Well, now that the Portuguese were involved, this became even a bigger business. And so the Portuguese modeled their slave trading practices after the Arabs and the agreements that were already struck there. And so you need to recognize that it was predominantly the Europeans were kind of striking aspect of race was their calling in doing this. But secondly, as I mentioned earlier, with many of the Native Americans of Mesoamerica dying off, the Europeans recognized if their model for sugar and their model for extraction of resources was ever going to happen, there needed to be enslavement. And so this is how the Europeans justified the need to enslave people groups, primarily profit, in order to grow in strength amongst their European counterparts. This here is in Brazil a slave master, if you will, probably not the master, but actually the mayordomo, what would be like the manager of it. And you can see just the treatment of this man here who is beaten relentlessly for reasons we don't know, but that is often the brutal reality of what slavery had brought. We'll talk more about that later. But to conclude, a couple of things. Remember the Columbian Exchange, Alfred W. Crosby, a book that recognizes that both sides of the world had complementing and conflicting gifts that either side needed, and both sides, might have benefited for what had happened because of this. Okay, yes, millions of people died as a result of the Europeans arriving through the shores of Hispaniola, but also this saved millions of lives there on the Europe, and helped also save lives and increase population in Africa. The second thing is this Atlantic world, this trade practices that we're going to talk more about in the Atlantic trade later on in subsequent lectures. So with that, go Bears, keep it classy, and we'll be seeing you next time.